to you watching online to session 3 of our Lent course, Journey Through the Bible. And by the end of this session, we'll be over halfway through the Bible. We'll have covered 39 books out of the 66 that we find in the Bible, and a few more, but we'll come to those in just a moment. Just again to remind you, on the back, if you find this helpful, we've got the different books in the Bible, this library that is the Holy Scriptures. Just encouraging as we go through each book, you might find it helpful just to write in those. So just helps you to remember where these books come in the order of the Bible. Now, I was actually looking in a Hebrew Old Testament the other day, and to really confuse matters, they actually have the books in a slightly different order. I should have brought one along to show you, but they include some of the books, like, for example, Daniel, not within the prophets, but within the history books instead, which then come later. They're the same books, but they're in a slightly different order. So there's a little trivia fact for you there. Now, last time in session 2, we were thinking about history. We were thinking about all of the kings and the nation of Israel, and then it's separating about these great kings. Thinking people like Saul and David and Solomon. And we're also thinking about the poetry and wisdom, things like the Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and the Song of Songs as well. But this week we're coming on to this last group, which split into 2 parts of the prophets. Now you see it's labelled the major prophets and the minor prophets. That's not because some of them are more important than the others. It's not because some of them sound more like the major king and all cheery and the minor ones are all depressing. They're purely labelled as that because the major ones are longer. They have more chapters in them than the minor prophets are generally smaller. So that's why there's the difference between the two. And just to remind us, we're thinking about this, the Bible isn't just a textbook, it's not just a collection of historical texts, it's like a gold mine. It's like a gold mine where you might discover that there are nuggets on the surface when you first go to it. Oh, that's what I'm excited, oh, that's good. But actually, the deeper you dig, the richer it gets, the more gold you discover. And that's particularly exciting when we share that with one another. Personal Bible reading is important, but so is things like encouraging someone else with a Bible verse or something that you found. But also as we meet for our Bible study groups on a Wednesday, we are delving in together to this gold mine and sharing those beautiful jewels as we find them. Sometimes you might notice something in there that I've completely missed. So it's an enriching experience when we mine this gold together. So we're going to be looking at these major prophets, minor prophets. Now, I think it was last week or perhaps the week before, someone mentioned a couple of books, including something called Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes, and that makes up what's part of something called the Apocrypha. Now, we're going to get to that at the end, and what it is, and why we may or may not consider that part of the Bible, but we won't worry about that just to begin with. So as we've been thinking, there are 5 points on this journey. We're using familiar places that we walk past. First, we're down at Hove Park, we walked up the hill to Waitrose. We're at this place today. Does anyone know where we've got to today on our walk? We're at one stop, right? So we're halfway on our journey. It's not a very exciting journey, but perhaps it's one that you might go along quite often. It's easy to remember, and it's all going up a hill, and we'll explore next week and the week afterwards. It's pretty obvious where this is going, isn't it? But anyway, we've been using these 5 steps to break up the Bible into these 5 sections, how God's kingdom is revealed. And we thought about those. Do you remember those 3 P's? Helps to remember what God's kingdom is. God's place, God's people, and God's presence. Yeah, so God's place, God's people, God's presence. First week we were thinking about the kingdom revealed. Last week we were thinking about the kingdom ruled. And this week as we come to the prophets, we're thinking about the kingdom prophesied. The kingdom prophesied. And again, yes, we are at one stop. I think that's before they had the sort of the renewal working where they put the brick wallpaper on and stuff like that. But we're looking at Isaiah through to Malachi, but we're also going to include something of again what is called the Apocrypha. In terms of the kind of type of writing that this is, there's variety. Prophecy in and of itself is its own kind of genre. Within those books, it's interspersed with history and story and poetry. But the prophecy, this sort of foretelling of what is going to come, is all about a new kind of kingdom. We've seen in the last couple of weeks how the kings failed the people and how the priests were self-interested and the shepherds refused and didn't look after God's people. And these prophets point towards a new kind of kingdom, of course, pointing in one direction, as we've thought about throughout the Old Testament, pointing to Jesus. So let's just remind ourselves a bit about who these characters are, the prophets. There's a picture here of Samuel, the child speaking with Eli, the priest Samuel, who would become a great prophet in the life of God's people. But the role of a prophet is to be the mouthpiece of God, is to bring God's words to God's people, but to all people, anyone who would listen. And we see the prophets going not just to the ancestors of Abraham, the Israelites, but also to others as well. But I think the role of a prophet, no one's going to go along to the judge and say, "Oh, I'd love to be a prophet, please," because they often would be accompanied by a rather unpopular message. You'd have to go and speak to the king, but that bad thing that he's doing, he needs to stop doing, otherwise there's going to be trouble. So, hence why there was a temptation for the prophets to say, "Oh yes, you're doing everything wonderfully, Your Majesty. You don't worry about anything at all." Often had an unpopular message. It was a message that people needed to hear. And it was a temptation, no doubt, for them to water down what God wanted to say. And obviously that's still the case for people's, speaking out today. There's always a temptation to step back a little bit and perhaps not to share the whole counsel of God. But we see different prophets pop up in the Bible. Perhaps you might say the first prophet would be Moses, someone who spoke to the people, given words by God. And then we get to the 9th century BC, and we get these two key prophets in the northern kingdom, Elijah and Elisha. And some great and exciting stories about Elijah and Elisha in 1 and 2 Kings. But then, sort of after that, by the time of the 8th century BC, the prophets began writing down their oracles into these 17 books. It said the major prophets were the long ones, and the minor prophets, the small ones. But throughout all these prophets, in the different times, there were two main themes: the themes of judgment and the themes of hope. Judgment and hope. Those themes kind of running parallel together. If you imagine like train tracks going off into the distance, judgment and hope, but on the same track, going in the same direction. Judgment because God is holy, and because rebellion against God has serious consequences. But God is also giving his people another chance. We've seen that in the Old Testament time and time again. Think about the judges. God giving his people another chance to turn back to him and for him to rescue them. So there is hope despite the judgment. So I thought we'd just pause there for a moment, have a chat with the person next to you, and maybe say, is there anywhere that you see in the world at the moment where people are crying out for judgment and for hope? We'll just have a chat, or if you're watching this at home, have a think about that for a moment. So where do you see the world crying out for judgment and for hope? It's another 15 seconds or so to share. Okay, well, if I can draw you back, sorry to interrupt you there. Any ideas? What things we come in? Where do we see the world crying out for judgment and hope? Anyone?
Well, I'll just chip in because the obvious one, I'm sure will get mentioned, but climate change.
Right, yeah.
I think is a subject where perhaps the third world is sort of trying to judge the rich world as having caused the problem. There's a grain of truth in that. And vice versa, the rich world is saying, you've got to stop using coal now. We used it in the past. So there's judgment on both sides, but hopefully there's hope on both sides that if we can get our act together as a world, we're going to avoid the worst of it. So I just offer that.
Yeah, I think climate change is a really helpful one. Yeah. Any other thoughts people have?
Well, maybe I'm saying Ukraine.
Yeah. And what about the situation in Ukraine that's bringing up these themes of judgment and hope, do you think? The particular things you think?
Well, I feel that everybody has an opinion about this matter.
Yeah.
I think we hope every day that in the middle of the night, we will hear God's voice and gently talking to him. I mean, I feel he just isn't listening to people.
No. So again, with this whole situation in Ukraine and Russia as well, I think what we've highlighted two really important things. Because when we think about, and this is also what happens with the prophets, when we think about judgment and hope, we think about things in the short term as well. So we think about judgment in terms of people judging one another, perhaps in terms of who they blame for climate change, but also judgment being this idea of God setting things right. It's this idea of balance and how things should be, and His peace, His shalom, rule. There's that short-term sense, and also with the hope. A hope that actually the war will stop, hope that the climate will stop getting damaged and that people make meaningful changes. But there's also this future point as well, with this idea of this great judgment where everything, the big things in the world, but also the way that that person was treated in a small way, or was abused or something, or the hope that actually one day none of these things will ever exist again. There's also this future hope. So you see the prophets doing that. They're doing talking about the short-term judgment and hope, but also the long-term. That one day, again, that cycle will end. There won't be any more wars. There won't be any more damage to our world being done. So, which then ties us on to the way that the prophets, way that these books are written. And then they're quite unique. People who know more about Hebrew language than I do talk about the prophets being written in what's called the prophetic tense, which is this idea of talking about a future event, but as if it has already happened, because there's such certainty about it. And obviously, we think God is outside of time anyway. A future event as if it's already taken place. This Hebrew way of talking about it, but we don't have anything like that in English. Either we talk about stuff in the past, the present, and the future. But in Hebrew prophetic writing, this idea of the prophetic tense, a future event, but somehow they're talking about it as if it's already taken place. But where do they all fit? Well, this is something that's hopefully a bit of a guide. Apologies if it's not super clear. You can see it on the screen, these handouts, and there should be a link that I'll put under the description of the video. But it gives you a bit of an idea as to what's going on. And we were thinking last time about these bigger nations, these big empires over in the east, coming in to try and do damage, to take over the land. The Syrians, the Babylonians, and the Medes and Persians. And you see the timeline there on the bottom, but you also see in blue, you see the kings spoken about in the southern kingdom in Judah, but also in that maroon colour in the northern kingdom. We see that the Assyrians did away with those before the southern kingdom, the blue ones, were taken to that 70-year exile. And you see some of those different names written at different points. Something like Jonah and Joel coming quite early on, whereas some of the other ones, like Malachi, coming right at the end. Now, some of these aren't perfect, they're open to some degree of disagreement, but it gives you a rough idea as the kind of context that they're talking about. Some of the kings that were ruling in the same time. But again, these new elements about all those different kings of a new kind of kingdom coming, and ultimately of a new king. Hope of a new kingdom and a new king. So as we've seen, there are these two kingdoms. Israel in the north, which eventually gets scattered, dealt away by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom, which gets exiled to Babylon, comes back 70 years later. So let's start off by looking. Some of these we're going to spend a bit more time in than others. I will try to keep our time to just under an hour. So I'm not going to go into huge detail, but hopefully give you some of the key things. So firstly, the first book we've got is Isaiah. There's some wonderful bits in Isaiah, all 66 chapters. The name Isaiah is obviously the prophet's name, and it means Yahweh, or the Lord, is salvation. So even in the name, we get a bit of a clue of what's going on there. Now, a lot of stuff has been written in the last 100 years or so about this character Isaiah. In particular, was it one person? Was Isaiah one person? And the book of Isaiah, was it written by different people? Because there's some issues. By the time you start getting later on into the book of Isaiah, it's talking about people like King Cyrus. Now, if we read the beginning of Isaiah, we look at the timeline, King Cyrus doesn't come for a long time after supposedly the death of Isaiah. So some people say, well, how could Isaiah have known that? This is obviously a later addition. Some would say the style of some of the writing changes. So some people have deposited that actually Isaiah may have been 3 different people writing in a similar vein, or perhaps more. We don't know. One of the things I think is important and leads me to think that perhaps what we have here is of one author, is that Jesus quotes from different parts of Isaiah, yet attributes it to one author. So this is in John chapter 12. So even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they would still not believe in him. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet. Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom is the answer will be revealed. So that comes from Isaiah 53, which some scholars would say is second, or they call Deutero Isaiah. So there's a different person writing. But then he continues, for this reason they could not believe, because as Isaiah says elsewhere, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, so they can neither see their eyes nor understand their hearts, nor turn and heal them. Isaiah 6, which is traditionally attributed to Isaiah himself, the prophet. So from there it seems to be the plain reading I would say, you can disagree with this, that's absolutely fine. It's not too important in today, but I just want to introduce this idea, is that I think that Jesus is talking about one person as Isaiah, but we can have disagreements on that. But in terms of actually what Isaiah is about, well, we see a few things in the book. In chapter 6 we hear about his calling, and he appears in the throne room of heaven, and he's so ashamed of what he's done that he has an experience of God, and God calls him to this prophetic ministry. But Isaiah also talks again about a new king who's going to come, and we see throughout the book of Isaiah allusions to this mysterious messianic figure. So in chapters 42 to 53, particularly in Isaiah 53, that famous thing, the servant song, surely he was crushed for our iniquities. Such an incredible prophetic image, written hundreds of years, however you date Isaiah, written hundreds of years before our Lord experienced on Good Friday. But also this figure, he would be for the nations, not just for the people of Israel, chapter 49. He would be a suffering figure, as we see in chapter 53. But Isaiah also, towards the end, in chapter 65, alludes to this idea of a new creation. This new way of the kingdom existing, not being limited in one place with 40 kings and all the problems therein. So that's Isaiah. So many things I could say about it, that's what I'm going to say. Next prophet we come to Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, again, he's called at a very young age, actually, by God to become a prophet. And he comes after the time of Isaiah, leading up to the exile, this time when God's people are taken out of the land. But again, we think about what the prophets are saying, they're looking forward to this kingdom prophesied. Jeremiah 31:31, helpful way of remembering says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah." And Jeremiah, again, he was writing during this time where he sees all the destruction going on in Jerusalem, the temple being destroyed, and these two things again of judgment and hope. But again, out of that, he makes God gives him this promise that unlike the old covenant, the promise that was made to Moses about how the people were to live, the promise about what that meant, God is saying through Jeremiah, "I'm going to make a new kind of agreement with people, one that's different." And he carries on. He says this. Mouse to work. He said, "It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt," so he's talking about the Exodus, "because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts." So God is going to be doing something on the inside of his people, not just teaching them stuff on the outside, so on the inside. "I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbour or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more." So this promise of a new covenant tied to the forgiveness of sins. So the old covenant, think about Moses and the people of Israel, those 12 tribes. What was the sign of being part of that old covenant? It was circumcision. That was the sign that you belonged. Well, certainly if you were there, belonged to that people group. That's still practiced today. What about the new covenant? Well, we don't look to Moses, we look to Jesus. He has brought about the new covenant, and it's not the people of Israel, but it's the church, which obviously includes believers in the Lord Jesus who are Jewish, but also includes non-Jewish people, like probably most of us, who are part of this new kingdom. And the sign we don't use circumcision, the sign we use is baptism, an entrance into the people of God. And Jeremiah writes a lot about this. He also writes a little book at the end as well, called Lamentations, which is again, this is a personal lament about what he is seeing happening in Jerusalem to the temple, about the state of the people. But there's this wonderful little hope again. We've got all the judgment there. There's hope at the same time. Chapter 3, verse 22 to 23. "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." So amazing words in that context of seeing people starving and dying and being taken away. There's still hope there as well. So that's Jeremiah. Next major prophet, Ezekiel. Ezekiel's similar kind of time to Jeremiah, but unlike Jeremiah who stayed there, Ezekiel was taken away into exile. And two particular themes that Ezekiel picks up on. There's all kinds of rather mucky stuff in Ezekiel, lots of stuff to do with poo. But two particular things that he highlights. One is this idea that God will give his people a new heart. A new heart, not made of stone, not hard heart, but a new kind of heart. But then there's also this wonderful vision that he's given about this valley of dry bones. And Ezekiel was asked, "Do you see these dry bones? Can they come alive?" And Ezekiel said, "Well, only you know, Lord." And he sees these visions of all these tendons and sinews growing into these bones, and they're becoming a whole arm of God bringing life where there was death, of resurrection, and again a new kind of people, given new hearts and new spiritual rebirth that Ezekiel is testifying to. Next prophet we've got then, Daniel. Perhaps Daniel you probably know more than others because of familiarity with two of the big stories. Now Daniel, again, he is over in Babylon. He's been taken over there. He's one of the rather promising young men. And Daniel is all about God's sovereignty. So God being the king. But it's split into two parts, really, Daniel. The first half is more history. And we read about two exciting stories. First, Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who get thrown into the fiery furnace. You remember the story. they won't bow down and worship this great big idol of the Babylonian king. And they get thrown in, but the king's looking on and he can't believe it, because even though they threw 3 people in there, there's a 4th person in there with them. Who is this 4th person? He says, someone who looks like one of the gods. Who is in there? And then we're told they come out and they don't even smell the fire. Whereas the soldiers who had the rather unpleasant job of having to throw them in, they were actually burnt up to a crisp anyway. But his 3 friends were kept safe because they trusted in God. They said, but even if God doesn't keep us safe, we will not bow down to that idol. So God's people being courageous in a difficult time. And then, of course, we have the story again of Daniel and the lion's den, because Daniel would continue to pray to God. Yes, he was living in a different land, speaking a new language, but he would continue to pray towards Jerusalem from his window. And he was thrown to the lions. He was kept safe. Some wonderful stories. But then the other kind of shifts and becomes more prophecy about these future visions of judgment and hope. And in particular, one bit where Daniel describes the appearance and the coming of the Son of Man coming on the clouds with glory, which is a very rich image that Jesus chooses to identify with this Son of Man. And actually that phrase, Son of Man, appears time and time again in the prophets. One of the reasons I don't like the NRSV, which is one of the translations, is it doesn't translate as Son of Man, it calls it mortal, which introduces a problem when Jesus is talking about Son of Man. It's a fine translation in other ways, but in that regard, I think it lets it down. Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man, this new kind of man. Adam was the man who got it wrong. Here's the new kind of man who got it right. So that's Daniel, and that's the end of the major prophets. Then we're on to the poor and minor prophets. But each one of them has got an interesting story to tell. No less Hosea, who is a prophet who's been tasked by God to go and marry a prostitute. What's going on here? But what's happening, what's acted out in Hosea's life with his marriage to this woman called Gomer, who was unfaithful to him, is it's a demonstration of God's love for his people. And even though God's people have been unfaithful, they've gone after other gods, other husbands, he is to remain faithful to his wife. And it's all about God's fierce and tender love for what we might call spiritual adulterers, people who are going after other gods, other idols. But again, even with that, a pointer to not just God's people being in some kind of relationship with God, but the church as the bride. And again, a rich imagery that we picked up as we look into the New Testament, into the book of Revelation as well. The church as the bride of Christ, God being married to his people. That's Hosea. Then we're moving on to Joel. Joel is after the exile, so after the people come back. But again, this warning of a greater judgment still to come. But one verse in particular, or 2 verses, picked up, and you might recognise it, perhaps with the image on the screen. This is in Joel, and it says, "And afterward, after the great and terrible day of the Lord, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both women and men, I will pour out my spirit in those days." So any ideas what Prophet Joel was alluding to at that moment? What the church interpreted that as? So it might include the fire on the heads. 40 days after Easter. Begins with a pin. Yeah. So it's the Holy Spirit coming at Pentecost. Causing the people to be able to speak out. God sending his spirit on all these people, again prophesied by the prophet Joel. That didn't just happen by accident. God didn't think, oh, I'm just going to do that. It was spoken about hundreds of years. It was a promise for God's people to hold on to. So that's the book, Prophet Joel. Then we move on to Amos. These aren't in a chronological order. They, as you can see, they go about all over the place. So having something like that is helpful. So goodness, when does Amos come in the process? We think, okay, Amos. Oh, right, yes, he was sort of earlier on. And he was a prophet to the northern kingdom when they were sort of experiencing quite a good time, really. And he came as a shepherd, again I think of being a shepherd, with this idea of God's justice. Because the people of Israel expected that God was, he was going to have judgment on all those other bad nations around them that were causing the problems. But Amos says, well, actually, you're included as well. God's not going to leave you out. You've got some special privileged position. God's going to judge everyone fairly. And he warned this judgment would be for them too. Obadiah, sorry, I don't have a picture of Obadiah. It's the shortest book in the Old Testament. I got that wrong with the other Sunday. But Obadiah deals with judgment actually on one of Israel's neighbours, on Edom. Now, if we remember all the way back to the first week, we were thinking about how there was Abraham and Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. The nation of Edom traditionally came from Esau, so Jacob's brother. So they were sort of cousins, but they had made life very difficult for the people of Israel. But again, in Obadiah, verse 21 in particular, promise of a future kingdom there is again. And then we've got the story of Jonah, which I think is probably my favourite out of the prophets. Because Jonah is a bit of a grump, really, isn't Jonah? He's obviously quite a famous prophet. And you've got these 4 chapters. And the first chapter, God calls Jonah to go to this great big city called Nineveh. He says, I want you to go to Nineveh. I know it's one of your enemies, and I know it's a big scary place. But I want you to go there, and I want you to tell the people to repent, to stop doing what they're doing, to turn to me. And Jonah says, oh, that's a good idea, God. And gets on a boat to go in the opposite direction. But obviously you can't outrun God. And he's on this boat, there's a terrible storm, and then he admits to the other sailors there, okay, it's my fault this storm, God sent this storm because I'm running away from him. And he said, the only thing you can do is throw me overboard. So they reluctantly do that at the end. And then at the end we're told that they actually begin worshipping God as well, these people who were, again, outsiders. But then the storm calms, but then God sends a great big fish to swallow up Jonah. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is Jonah's prayer from inside this fish. And again, importantly, Jonah is in this fish for 3 days against something that Jesus would allude to. He said, no sign will this generation have except the sign of the prophet Jonah. But just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so will the Son of Man be in the earth for 3 days until he rises. Then chapter 3, God's heard Jonah's prayer and the fish has spat him out. So he decides, okay, right, I will go to Nineveh. And he does. And they're sorry for what they've done. And they stop doing the bad things. And then you think, okay, right, we'll finish there. That's a good story, isn't it? But then chapter 4, Jonah has a grumble with God. He's angry with God because God has forgiven these people, these enemies of Jonah's people. He said, I knew you would do something like this, God. I knew you'd forgive them. And he gets really angry with God. And that's kind of how it finishes. But again, with Jonah, we get this picture of a kingdom that includes the other nations. God's forgiveness, not just to the people of Israel, but to the other nations being brought as well. I'm going to speed through some of these later ones. So we've got the prophet Micah, which is about judgment and forgiveness coming from the shepherd king. And then the prophet Nahum, where the people are told to take refuge in God now before it's too late. Don't just keep putting them off and off and off. Now is the time to seek refuge in God before it's too late. And then Habakkuk, which is a great name, isn't it? People don't call their children Habakkuk. I know Micah, I don't think I know her name, but I certainly don't know Habakkuk. Habakkuk age. Too late now. But Habakkuk is interesting one again. It's a complaint. The prophet is actually complaining to God because he's saying, God, you seem absent. It seems like you're not really helping us. It seems like, I'm not even sure if you listen. Verse 2 says, God, are you listening? But it's also a great example of someone crying out to God, but at the same time resting in who God is. And a relationship with God is able to hold those things. We're able to cry out to God. We're able to tell him as it is, but at the same time, we're also able to rest in him. And it's holding those two things. Sometimes we think we can only do one or the other, but Habakkuk shows that we can do both. Then the next thing we've got is Zephaniah. Zephaniah, which is about a warning that the day of the Lord, this day when God is going to do a new thing, is coming, is getting near. So again, you need to get ready by trusting in the name of the Lord. Haggai is about this idea of the renewed temple and the whole context of rebuilding. So remember, after the exile, they had to come back and they had to rebuild the temples that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. But it says they're doing this rebuilding. Actually, all of this points to this idea of not just rebuilding a building, but a new, renewed relationship with God. Learn from the mistakes of the past, concentrate on rebuilding your relationship with God. And then Zechariah, again, predicts the coming Messiah. Thankfully, chapter 3, he talks about atone for the sins of the people in a single day. There will be one day when this Messiah will atone, will make the people right in one day. Now, he doesn't say how he's going to do that, what it's going to look like. But again, another prophecy towards this coming Messiah. And then the last book in the prophets is the prophet Malachi. And Malachi, again, similar to the other prophets, but finishes with this promise, the last verses in the Old Testament. And he says this: "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of their parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction." So now Elijah, we know, lived hundreds of years before Malachi, but we're saying that he's going to send the prophet Elijah, or perhaps a nickname. Any idea who he's talking about then at that point?
Pointing to Jesus, I suppose.
He's not talking about Jesus, he's talking about someone who's going to prepare the way. This one, John the Baptist. So he's talking about there will be another prophet coming one day who is going to be actually the last of these types of prophets. But he will have a special role in his prophetic line. But that's not going to happen for, well, they don't know at the time, but it's not going to happen for 400 years. So then after Malachi, nothing. Silence for 400 years. God seems to be silent on those promises about the Messiah, what's going to happen. Perhaps they rise in expectation from one generation, but nothing happens. None of these prophets in the way that those prophets were exercising in ministry. We have the end of the Old Testament. But, that's where things get slightly complicated. Some Bibles include something in it called the Apocrypha. Now, let's just give a little bit of a context of what's going on. So, much of the books in the Apocrypha can be sort of rooted in sort of about in 1 to 200 BC. So sort of halfway between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. About halfway. Some of those, though, are additions to other books. So, for example, in the Apocrypha, which are these collections of writings, there are additions to Daniel, or as what I was listening to yesterday, it talks about the prayer of those 3 people in the furnace. The Apocrypha has a prayer attributed to them as well, but a lot of the context relates about this thing called the Maccabean Revolt, again about 160 BC, that sort of area. And the new empire that had come in were the Seleucid Empire, we think about from Alexander the Great, so the Greek Empire spreading out around the Mediterranean. And this one person in particular who caused a lot of trouble for the Jews in that land, called Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. And he was very vicious in his persecution of the Jews, and even went into the temple in Jerusalem, built an altar to Zeus, the Greek king of the gods, and sacrificed a pig on it. So, if you imagine the worst thing for a Jew is an altar to one of the other pagan gods in the temple, and then sacrificing a pig, something that was meant to be unclean. But something that's actually prophesied by the prophet Daniel, that this would happen, again, beforehand. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. So again, in that he's talking about this thing that will happen and this king coming in. But the book of Maccabees talks about this revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's ended up getting kicked out of the land and dying rather miserably. And actually that's after that the temple was then rededicated, and that's where the Jewish festival of Hanukkah comes from. So you know the lights in the temple staying on of this rededication of the temple. But in terms of the Apocrypha, first there's a slight misnomer. There is no one Apocrypha. Different denominations have different additional books in addition to the 66. Now, we're not talking about apocryphal books in the New Testament. We'll talk about that another time. We're talking about apocryphal books in the Old Testament. So different denominations have different extra books. So see, the Roman Catholic Church have these books here. So for example, things like 1 and 2 Maccabees talking about that involvement. Again, Song of the Three, which is the prayer of the three people in the fiery furnace. Bell and the Dragon, which is a great. Some of these are great stories. Wisdom of Solomon, also known as Ecclesiasticus as well. Some additions to the book of Esther and a few other ones as well. But these are all dated later than the prophets. These are happening anywhere from sort of 200 BC, even possibly up to the time of Christ. They're not entirely sure. But then Greek Orthodox has a few. They have 3 and 4 Maccabees. And then Psalm 151, which is a psalm about David fighting Goliath. Russian Orthodox, again, they have a couple of extra ones. They don't have 4 Maccabees. So if you want 4 Maccabees, you've got to be Greek Orthodox, not Russian Orthodox. And then the Coptics have a few ones as well. So, you know, what are these? Why do we have them and why don't we have them? What should we think about them? Well, let's just see where we go to. So one of the things about these books is why we're not including them within the 66 books of the Bible is partly because of what happened at the Reformation. So the Reformation, when the church was split from the Roman Catholic Church, was had to decide what books were in the Bible. And the way it did that is not just by picking and choosing its favourite ones, was by going back to actually what did the early church fathers, what were the early church using? What was their Bible? Or what was, in Jesus' day, what was he referring when he said, have you not read? And he's talking about the scriptures. What books is he talking about? Is he talking about those other ones in the Apocrypha or not? So one of the things that's saying how the early church did it. They also have to look at the New Testament and say, does the New Testament refer to these books? Does it reference them in some way? Does it talk about them as being part of the Bible? And they found that they weren't included within certainly the majority of early lists in the church of books in the Bible, and they weren't quoted by the New Testament authors. Apart from that, there was some difference, some slight contradictory teaching going on with some of these to what was in the Bible, and some of the historical accounts, as valuable as they are, actually not being true, referencing different kings who were alive at actually different times to what we know to be true from the history books, and that they weren't necessarily written by the people who claimed to be by letters of Jeremiah, probably was written by Jeremiah. So they said, okay, these are important, but we don't think that they should be counted as the Holy Bible, as the Scriptures, because it's out of the Holy Bible that we determine our doctrine, what God is like, and what we should do and what we shouldn't do. But again, another thing, the church was quite happy for many centuries before the Reformation to include these as books that were valuable, but kind of a sort of fork in the road happened at the Reformation. Now, partly to do with this chap here, Martin Luther. And Martin Luther famously objected to what the Roman Catholic Church was doing in one particular way. They were selling time off for your dead relatives in purgatory. If you give us some money, we will sell you so-called an indulgence, which means that your love, your mum or dad who died, they're now in purgatory suffering for their sins. If you give us some money, we will speed up their time, because you don't want them to be suffering, do you? And Luther just hated this idea, quite rightly so. It's terrible idea. And but obviously he didn't make too many friends with the Roman Catholic Church. He wanted to remain part of that. He wanted to see the church reformed. He didn't want to break away from evil. He wanted to see it reformed. And he said, well, it doesn't say in the Bible that we should be doing stuff like this. But then what happened is to underpin their stance, the Roman Catholic Church, at the Council of Trent, they decided to make the Apocrypha officially part of the Bible. So before that, it hadn't been seen as officially part of the Scriptures, but they decided to do that. And partly because of what's written in one of the books, 2 Maccabees, which talks about how you should pray for dead people to enable to have their sins forgiven once they've died. Now, because that was an original part of the Bible, that wasn't as much of a point, but if all of a sudden it is part of the Bible, that now informs your doctrine and the things that you do. So now praying for the dead to have their sins taken away is now part of the Roman Catholic Bible. But us being Anglicans, where do we kind of sit? Because obviously we've come out of the Reformed tradition. We are the protesting church, but also we remain Catholic as in universal. Well, Anglicanism kind of had a third way during the Reformation. In the Bible, we've got the 39 articles of religion. So, what do we do with these apocryphal books? Do we say, yes, they're part of the Bible, like Roman Catholics, or do we say they've got nothing to teach us, we're not interested? Well, the prayer book makes it a third way. And it says, in the other books, as Jerome said, I think it was an early translator for the Roman Catholic Church, the church doth read, for example, of life, an instruction of manners, but yet doth it not apply them to establish any doctrine. So these are good books. These are helpful books that tell us what life is like. They're, like you might read another Christian book. It helps you in your journey. It's full of wisdom. It's full of things. But they're not treated like the other books in terms of this is where we get our official teaching from. That's the official Church of England sort of place. But I mean, something like 1 Maccabees is a great example of history at the time and really helps to fill in what was happening between those 2 time periods. That's all I'm going to say on that. I do want to finish with this slide on where we've got to. So think about the kingdom prophesied, God's people, God's place, God's presence. So what we're saying here, if we look forward to the end of the Old Testament, God's people, when there's this prophecy that they'll have new hearts. They'll be renewed in some way. God's place, we're told in Isaiah 11, will be like a new Eden. The wolf and the lamb will lie down together, and the little child will lead them. There's this new idyllic kind of promise about God's place. And God's presence, as we saw in Jonah, God will pour out His Spirit. He will come to dwell in His people. So that's the expectation. But we haven't got to actually how that works itself out, and we'll be looking at that next week as we think about the coming kingdom with the Gospels and with Acts. We look at Matthew, Mark, Luke and John and the book of Acts. So thank you for coming, and I hope you found that helpful, and we'll see you next time.